Hi there, it's Archie. I'm back for the ADHD Care Podcast. Hope I find you well today. I'm joined by Alexia Hetzel, who's an executive coach, neurodiversity consultant, and works with senior leaders, founders, and C-suite executives, as well as HR and DEI team supporting them. Alexia is based in Luxembourg and works internationally in both English and French. Alexa describes herself as a chaos whisperer for high pressure roles. Alexia's work centers around a real interesting idea that ADHD in leadership isn't so much about ability or motivation, but more about how things are understood and interpreted. She focuses on helping bridge the gap between how ADHD leaders experience things internally and how they can come across externally, and how what the gap is understood, it can actually become a real strength for both the individual and also the organization. So really, really interested to bring Alexia onto our podcast today. I actually met Alexia at the International Conference on ADHD at the back end of last year over in the US in Kansas City. We spoke briefly. I was quite keen to bring her on. So I'm glad that we managed to set some time for Alexia to come on as a guest on our podcast. So let's bring her on. Hello.
Hi,
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good to
Okay.
see you.
Yes, I know, since Kansas City,
I know.
from which we almost never made it back, right? I mean, it
I
was
know.
crazy.
It was. I mean, the flight. We were messed around with the flights, cancelled and rescheduled
Mhm.
and postponed and everything. So, yeah, I'm glad you made it back safely. And yeah, I was so keen to bring you on to come and talk more about yourself and your amazing role as an executive coach, particularly in this kind of neurodiverse field. So,
Mhm.
where are you now in the world?
I am based in Luxembourg, where there's a ton of unexplored territory for what I'm doing. So, yeah.
Yeah, wow. I'll be quite fascinated to learn more about how the neurodiverse industry is set up where you are. And I know obviously you work with clients internationally as well.
I
So
work with
yeah,
clients internationally, yes, yes, but I
yeah,
try to make a dent here in Luxembourg because it's still quite a not a taboo topic, but
right.
it's pretty much unexplored.
Okay, amazing. So yeah, so as I said, thanks for sparing some time to come onto our podcast. Absolute pleasure to have you. I mean, just to start off, maybe we can start talking about your work. So in terms of what led you into kind of working with senior leaders and neurodiversity individuals, what was it that interested you in kind of coming into work in this field?
Well, actually, it was a very personal story to start with. I got my own ADHD diagnosis in my 20s, and I didn't do much with that diagnosis for a while until I met an ADHD coach. And I was very fortunate to be coached by that person for a straight 2 hours as a sort of sample. And it was a slap in the face, a very positive and necessary one. I thought, wow, this is amazing. Someone actually understands my brain wiring. We need more of this. And I remember stepping out of that session thinking, one day I want to do the same thing. And contrary to my usual ADHD way, that one day became now. So I actually got trained as a coach, a generalist coach first, then specialized in ADHD, extended my knowledge to other neurodivergent profiles, and I used my own stories and struggles in the corporate world to take that into my work. So I now coach individuals who approach me privately, but I also work with companies who need their executives coached or some senior staff coached, and there's quite a lot to do there.
Fascinating. It's really, really interesting there. I mean, for our listeners who may not be familiar with your work, I mean, how would you describe what you do in kind of simple terms?
In simple terms, have I've made a point to make sure that people who are neurodivergent completely embrace how they work. I want people to work with their brain and not against it. So I am a sparring partner and a chaos whisperer, and I basically engage with people about their professional and personal struggles. And in simple terms, I'm really there to help them shed all the stigma and all the injunctions that they may have had put upon them throughout their school life, student life, sometimes work life, so that they can fully step into their strengths. So that's what I do with the individuals and with companies. I like to think of myself as the person who's going to help them embrace and future-proof the uniqueness of the cognitive range that they have in their staff that they may not even be aware of. I don't know if that was simple terms, but
Yeah. Yeah, simply enough. I'm sure our listeners kind of understood you there. You said that ADHD in leadership is less about the ability, more about the translation. It's a translation problem. Can you talk us through what you mean by that?
So when I talk about a translation problem, I'm thinking very much of an ecosystem like the one where I live in Luxembourg. Luxembourg is a place with a lot of banking and finance industries, a lot of law firms, highly regulated institutional environments with a lot of corporate politics, etc. And so I think that there's quite a lot out there in the research about ADHD leaders as entrepreneurs. There's a lot less out there about what it means to get to a certain level of responsibility in a company and have ADHD. And what I'm noticing is what I call, yes, a translation problem, because there are some mismatches that have existed for a while that I think still stubbornly exist. And they're all really they're predictable, they are preventable as well. And what I mean by this is, for example, there is a great mismatch in the experience versus the perception. So what I mean by this is that an ADHD person, whether or not actually they are in a leadership position, will tend to be someone who easily calls out the BS in meetings, who interrupts others, who has impulsive thinking. And this will be translated by other people as being rude or difficult. So things that are actually the person trying to retain a thread of thought, or seeing all the sugarcoating or politics as unnecessary noise, is just trying to really externalize their thoughts. And so while they are experiencing discomfort and trying to relieve that discomfort by speaking quite openly with straight talk, not being shy of not necessarily placing blame, but pointing at the things. You can count on an ADHD leader or an executive to really point at the things that don't work. And it's not that they want to focus on the negative, but it's like a brain itch that they need to scratch when they're talking about these things. And so what they're experiencing is just their pure logic really creating a traffic jam in their brain, and they really need to externalize it. And then the external perception is this person is rude, difficult, and know-it-all. That's one of the mismatches. Maybe the ADHD leader is not as polished as what we would expect other leaders to be. I think that there's also a sort of leadership archetype that needs to become outdated, in my opinion. And this is about linearity. There is an expectation, I think, or a sort of, I don't know if it's a fantasy, an archetype, but there is an expectation that a leader must be quite linear, not just So they must be linear, sequential, not just in their logic and their thinking, but also in how they display their emotions, right? We expect a leader to be poised, to not be fiery in the way they react or express themselves and how they display their emotions. And why I think this needs to be outdated is because, well, first of all, again, this is not a personality flaw. It is there is an ADHD intensity that is present, that can be very rich, and that needs to express itself. But also because in a corporate world where things are changing so fast, I think that the archetype of the linear leader really is almost becoming a liability if you think about it. Another point is this is actually a painful point, but once it's recognized, it can be made a lot easier on the ADHD leaders, ADHD employees in general, but it's about the invisible effort versus the visible output. So what I mean by this is that an organization really sees behavior, which I've covered, and output only. Everything in between is completely invisible. And ADHD leaders do the work that they're supposed to do, but they're also doing a lot of an enormous amount of extra invisible labor every day, managing their energy, their emotions, maintaining context for their teams, switching contexts, right? So they are having one-on-ones, group interactions, and even when they need sensory rest, right? They have to jump from one type of meeting and energy to another. They need to switch from maybe a HR context to then a strategic context. And even if this is often, this is really a hidden cost, right? But for people with ADHD, switching contexts all the time is a real energy drainer. And leadership comes with having to make those context switches all the time. And so I think that there's also a translation problem in that, in the sense that there is also an expectation that a leader needs to be able to have a HR conversation followed by a strategic conversation and just flip a switch like that. It's not always recognized that for some brains, this is taxing. It is possible. People with ADHD can switch, but it is taxing. And so I think that looking at this not as a character flaw or an ability gap, it's really almost for me, it's a systemic translation failure. And it's really amplified when you're at executive level. You're under bigger scrutiny, there are higher stakes, and there is a general discomfort with people whose functioning is variable.
Yeah. I mean, where do you tend to kind of see the gap show up most between how someone feels internally and how they are perceived by others?
Oh wow. Okay, so there's quite a lot there. For what I see really with the clients I coach in the executive space who identify as having ADHD or who are diagnosed with ADHD, I think that so first of all, there is a gap almost in the perception of ADHD as a whole. For the few leaders that I coach who do disclose their ADHD, this actually gets received with skepticism. You would not be where you are if you had ADHD, right? And so I think that there's a big gap there between the again this is a gap between what is the external perception and all of the hurdles and extra labor that has come for the ADHD leader to get to where they are. There's so many gaps between the internal experience and what is interpreted externally. Also, so again, in terms of the what is perceived as inconsistency, which is situational and energy variability, there is a clash between the way the ADHD way of being prolific. We are, I say we because I identify with this. People with ADHD tend to be prolific in spurts, right? We go through high energy moments and then lower energy moments. This is read externally as being unreliable or inconsistent. And this is, I think, because there's still a very present, like post-industrial idea that we need to be productive like machines, right? That we need to be constant. And in terms of the emotional intensity and the emotional labor, the ADHD brain is an emotional brain. If an executive committee meeting is going around in circles, nobody wants to address the root cause of an inefficient process or a problem, the ADHD executive is going to get very impatient and involved at almost a gut level. And so this is again perceived as, them trying to be a drama queen, when in fact it is their brain that is enabling them to be an early detector and a very intense detector of what is a pivotal problem. So we are again in the sort of brain itch that needs scratching moment. And this intensity, which can be extremely valuable in a lot of situations, is seen as something that needs to be managed, right? It is perceived externally as something that the person should really, really be working on. I think that there's also a gap between. So I'm taking a huge risk here by saying this, but I tend to find that ADHD profiles, especially in leadership positions, are extremely visionary. They are systemic thinkers. They can see very often more quickly and more clearly and intensely than other people the entire set of ramifications of what would look like to others as an isolated issue. And so because this thinking for them is so intuitive and fast, I see two things that can happen. They can't translate their entire thought process and their entire trail of thought in a way that is legible for others. And so they're classified as going off on a tangent, being the scattered individual. What can also happen is they can articulate their thoughts and where they're coming from and their arguments, but they may not pick the right moment, or they articulate it in a way that places blame, even if that's not their intention. And so I have coached executives before who have ADHD and have spoken to their peers on the executive committee. And the peers say, basically, when that person speaks, they make me feel like an idiot. And nobody wants to feel like an idiot, right? And so it is easier to sort of dismiss that person as being the impulsive talker, going off on a tangent, going off topic, when really they are on topic, but they are thinking in a more systemic way. Another thing also that is also a big gap is the aspect of verbal processing in ADHD. And this is a fascinating one. The ADHD brain often, so I should have started this with a big fat disclaimer, not all ADHD leaders will recognize themselves in this, but a lot of them actually use verbal processing almost like a large blank canvas. They speak at that canvas to project their thoughts onto it before giving them any order. And when you are in a company and you're dealing with teams, your underlings, or your peers, this can come across as chaotic. And so before coaching, many of my clients don't even realize that this is what they're doing in meetings. Sometimes they are just processing out loud, and they're not even necessarily expecting for things to be picked up or turned into something actionable. They are actually externalizing their thoughts. And so I know that we talk a lot about ADHD creativity in the ideation and innovation sense, and yes, that's huge. But I think that there's also a misread here and a little bit of a gap because what is happening for the person inside is that they are looking at things in a big picture sense. And for them, it is impossible to leave out one of the ramifications. And so it can be almost painful to ask those people to sort of let go of that thought, right? So there is a gap in this perception in the sense that the fact that they're identifying friction points, that ADHD leaders are very good at ideating around what are the friction points and how to fix them. It's seen as the person who complains all the time, right? So you get labeled with a difficult personality because the ADHD brain doesn't like to compromise very naturally. And so when you are in a corporate environment where optics and politics count, this sort of zero compromise approach, which can be a strength sometimes, is being read as someone who is trying to make everyone feel bad. I don't know if that's if you
Mm,
if that resonates with any of the other things that you've heard on this podcast, but
mm,
there is definitely a gap between the ADHD person is telling me, I feel like I'm doing the right thing. I feel like I am seeing the right gaps, and I feel like I'm always helping. And then the big misread is this person is just a pain.
mm. I mean, you just touched on some of the ADHD traits that are often misunderstood, particularly at that sort of leadership level, which is kind of was my next question actually. Um, so what do you think is kind of going on beneath the surface for this individual that we're describing who's presented with this misunderstood trait?
What is going on for the ADHD leader?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because obviously there's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lot of like, I mean, some of them are trying. All depends if they have the self. I think I'm getting a bit too far here, but sometimes if they're lacking that awareness, that can also cause some them. But what is it for that individual who's sitting in there in that situation that we just described, and they are feeling because they're battling with. Okay, obviously, there's this social acceptance that you have to be mindful in terms of how you come across, and they're also mindful about their level of leadership, senior in front of their work colleagues as well. But I'm just trying to work out in terms of like how does that feel? How does that sit for them? And I'm sure you've spoken to them to some of these leaders in your coaching work.
Mhm.
They describe them in terms of how that feeling, that internal feeling inside them in that situation.
There is a feeling of isolation and of loneliness and of being misunderstood. This creates a prolongation of life of self-doubt um, through their usually an entire life experience of am I crazy? Am I too intense? Am I too much? Am I doing this right? So I think that there's the what is being reported to me is I feel lonely, I feel misunderstood, and maybe they're right. So there is the risk with this, and this is what I see, is that some ADHD leaders tend to self-censor and isolate. This will come in different forms. So, the for example, ADHD leaders tend to over-own bad outcomes and under-own positive outcomes. And so, if they feel that they are in a leadership structure where their personality and their traits are coming across as too intense, they will try to, and maybe not even consciously, really, really isolate and try to stay under the radar, which also means that they will be less visible as leaders. There's a mixture there of it's stemming from the ADHD, but it's also stemming from how the ADHD perceived by others is making them feel. And what I mean by this is that they're in the corporate world, as a leader, let's say an executive, having a sort of personal brand and communicating internally about what you are achieving is almost as important as achieving it. People with ADHD tend to not naturally engage with this, the bragging, let's put it that way, right? To put it in raw terms. But especially if they are being systematically if they're being made to feel like the odd leader out, they will even less tend to communicate on the things that they are achieving. There is quite, I don't think that we should ignore the rejection sensitivity dysphoria that comes with ADHD that will also come in the leadership sphere. And this can be this so this can obviously be quite painful, but also sometimes come and affect the career prospects of those leaders. One of the ways that this happens is that a lot of ADHD leaders got to their high responsibility roles because they were excellent at what they were doing and they were being very reactive in their careers and accepting roles that were more and more or higher and higher up in the company. And then at some point, they may reach a place in the company that is so prominent that they're being asked, okay, what is your next step? What would you like to do next? And so because they have been made to feel, or they have been feeling almost as if they were not deserving of where they are already, when it gets to that point where they get to choose what their next career step is, they tell me, well, I don't know. What could I be asking? What could I really wish for? Am I good enough for this role or that role? And so this is quite an interesting thing to observe.
I think you touched on briefly about energy levels and the inconsistencies of energy levels. Are you able to give an example of how that might play out on a day to day on that individual?
Absolutely. I I have clients who notice that past a certain time in the day, uh, anything that crosses their desk or anyone who comes to talk to them, they will be completely they will be out of juice, right? And so some of them actually tend to not send emails that after they have reached that time because they know that the language they will use will be maybe a bit too raw, a bit too direct. So a lot of them need to keep themselves in check. The difference in energy levels will also be in how well they transition from one meeting to another. They will tell me that there are some meetings for which they are physically present but absent for the first 15 or 20 minutes while they are getting their brain into gear and catching up with the mental mode, loading up the mental mode that is necessary for them to engage in that meeting. In terms of the energy levels, I'm also, and this is quite a big challenge for leaders. They are expected to be very much present in different meetings, but also social events, etc. And they may need sensory rests at some point that they're not taking. And so what I'm seeing is that a good thing to work on with them is to help them realize what is their freshest moment in the day, how they can arrange their schedule around that. And in terms of the recuperation, I get a lot of resistance on this at the beginning of my coaching assignments because I tell ADHD leaders that if they see that after a one-on-one with their management teams or with their teams, they get they feel that they could do with a 20-minute reset. Maybe they've heard complaints from a team member who's bringing all sorts of grievances to them. because they take on so much emotional labor and they take on so much responsibility from what they're hearing. They feel that but they very rarely take the time to reset afterwards. And so I really encourage them to take those reset moments. At the beginning, they feel like it's going to be a luxury and that they can't do it. I need to be in meetings all day. I cannot take time between meetings. I cannot block a couple of hours a week just to take a breather, reassess how the week is going, how my energy levels are. But once they start doing it, everything goes much, much better.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask about this concept of invisible effort, where might be putting some effort into their work, which they feel might not be seen or acknowledged by their superiors.
Mhm.
Would you like to sort of elaborate a little bit more on that?
So there is real effort there. This effort is real. It's composed of a few things, but very much the regulation cost, right, on a day-to-day basis. So the fact that no one sees this doesn't mean that it's not happening. People with ADHD as leaders, they're not just regulating their own emotions and their own energy levels. They are also taking on the burdens of their teams for themselves. A number of ADHD leaders I coach, they tend to be very close to their teams. They tend to be social chameleons. They're not really, they like to engage directly, not just with their direct reports, but with everyone at every level of operations that they're responsible for. This is something that other leaders don't systematically do. And while this could be perceived as, okay, so this leader is just super social and super friendly, and they're just trying to navigate all the social strata of the organization. What they're telling me is they like to do it, but they also like to do it because it is their way to take the pulse of how things are going. They don't want information from how things are going and the team morale to be filtered by any managers that they have in place. They like to engage at all levels and hear from the people the everyday pain points. They don't have an ivory tower mentality. And they tell me that this is precious data to them and that so on the one hand it is costing them, right, because it is exposing themselves to the problems, the issues, the grievances, or the emotions of of a larger portion of people, but at the same time, it is something that they're storing as data and assets so that they have a very, very detailed view of the work that they're overseeing. And the over responsibility loop, so over owning anything that's not working or that is not performing as well as it should is also costing them. But at the same time, this really makes them uniquely placed to go back to this systemic thinking that I was talking about earlier. It's not just their intuition telling them all the systemic ramifications. They are really trying to make a point, even unconsciously, of really knowing from the ground up what what the operations look like. And so this, I think, is basically work, right? This is definitely work, but it is not being valued at the same level as interacting with major stakeholders. And however, it is extremely, extremely useful. So that's invisible work. So there's the self-regulation piece, the social chameleon and testing the pulse piece. There is also, as I said before, the fact that that's the fact the recognition may not always be to the level of the investment is also because a lot of my ADHD leaders, they tend to not want to take credit for things, right? They will always say, "Oh, it's thanks to my great manager and that person," and so again, it's a facade issue as well. That's also where some of the labor is invisible.
You talk about leader organization interface.
Hmm.
Do you want to tell us a little bit more about, in simple terms, again, what you mean by that?
The interface, well, that's really where where I try to come in. I'm not trying to fix or change the ADHD leader, and I'm not trying to fix or change the company. But when I talk about the leader organization interface, it's basically where are those friction points, where are those breakdown points, and how they could be avoided. And so, as I was saying before, organizations are very focused on outputs. Leaders get labeled. An ADHD leader might get labeled, and sometimes this cost compounds because they isolate. And another way that this can trickle down onto teams is actually that if the ADHD leader has been labeled as sort of the odd one out or the scattered leader, this can sometimes trickle down into how their teams feel. The teams can feel demotivated because they are standing behind a leader who doesn't have who's not being respected in the same way as other leaders on the leadership team. And so they sometimes can feel, even if they may very much appreciate their ADHD leaders, sometimes feel like they are working for the problem executive, right? Another way that this interface can break down, I mentioned it before, but it's that entire issue of the internal visibility. Um, the fact that this will trickle down onto the teams as well. If the ADHD leader is not always bragging or reporting as much on what the team is achieving, perhaps the team will be perceived as not performing as much. I think that's where the impact can be big is where the ADHD leader is not the CEO, but is part of the executive team, and the CEO does not understand the ADHD profile, and so the feedback can be timed inappropriately, or the CEO will be telling the ADHD leader, you have a real internal visibility problem. You need to be marketing yourself internally more. And the way that this also can fail is in the structural support that can be put in place. So this is at a very like more basic level, but ha having or giving leaders time to process retrospectively, maybe have more agency over their schedule without having to justify why they can only do two one-on-one meetings a day because they're so draining for them, um, why why they prefer to have meetings on a similar topic condensed into one day, and maybe have like a more themed approach to how they approach their attention span and week. There's not a lot of flexibility there for leaders because we always talk about ADHD employees and how to support them, but with leaders there is really this expectation that they just need to be responsive, and they tell me I don't have agency about where my attention needs to go. And so I think that this is really a big pain point that that could be avoided. The same output can be produced, the same work can be performed by an ADHD leader as any other leader, but they need to be encouraged to have more agency about how, when they expose themselves to the work.
Amazing. I mean, you know, I'm learning a lot from you, just listening to you because I do also work with some leaders, CEOs, and chief execs, and all of that in my clinical capacity in work. And some of the things that you're saying kind of resonates with what I hear in the clinic. So it's fascinating, and I'm hoping that this podcast is reaching out to a lot of people out there listening that might be struggling with what we're discussing here. If we flip it to maybe looking at the strength side of things. What does it look like when ADHD traits are sort of really working well in leadership roles?
I love that question. Um, so what's working really well, and this also is part of the interface. So what works really well is first of all when the ADHD leaders start embracing their full identity. So when there is open dialogue, mentioning ADHD or not, but if the ADHD leader can say, look, we all know that I'm the person who's good at spotting problems, or we all know that I'm the person who is good at fixing problems, or we all know I'm the kind of person who may take 20 minutes to ideate on something. And just to say, this is what I do, this is what I do well, and that's okay, that tends to work really, really well. And so also when there's more open communications, for example, I had a case where, and this was actually really positive, the CEO of a banking institution had an ADHD executive in the executive committee and asked me to educate him on ADHD for a whole 90 minutes, right? And so it was basically him being curious about, okay, so what does it really mean when this person cannot help but interrupt because they had a thought, or what does it mean when this person is telling us this? And so that the both sides can really start relabeling everything that's been happening. This can be really quite precious because then in executive committee meetings, what the change was, the shift was that even developing a vernacular amongst themselves, like, oh, you're processing verbally again, just calling it out as what it is, rather than, oh, you're going off on a tangent again. That can be quite powerful. Another thing that I've seen that's very interesting is that if the ADHD leader can embrace those traits and also understands where they become challenging for others, they can team up. The way that I've seen this happen is, for example, this time it was actually an ADHD CEO who would, in meetings, verbally process, think out loud, ideate. And then because he was the CEO, everyone was trying to take copious notes of the 37 points that the CEO had just mentioned as needing work. Then the teams would go off and would get really overwhelmed acting on those 37 points and would actually waste quite a lot of resources doing this. 4 weeks later, the CEO said, teams, what are you doing? Well, we're working on the 37 things you talked about. And the CEO said, no, but no, I was just thinking out loud. You didn't need to be working on all those things. So what happened then is that this CEO decided to trust a person with being the funnel, right? And so in terms of cognitive range in a company, this can be quite precious when you recognize that you are good at one part of the process, but then another person might be good at coming in and saying, okay, guys, you heard 37 things, but actually what we're going to focus on now are one, two, three, four. We park the rest and sort of trying to squeeze out the actionable elements from the wonderful ADHD ideating brain. So creating those sort of informal partnerships can also really, really work well. And there I mentioned this, the very creative CEO with the funnel person. What's also really powerful in corporate environments is actually the executive and their executive assistant, that pair, that can do wonders when the ADHD leader can be really honest about what they're really good at and what they need help with, an externalized memory, some lightweight weight systems, or if their executive assistant knows that how they which contexts they're better at switching from and to, and how much one-on-one interactions they can do. I have leaders now who have basically a briefing every Monday morning with their executive assistant on basically shaping the week so that the energy levels are respected, the mental bandwidth is respected, the attention allocation is doing at its best. So this can also be quite powerful.
It's sort of like advocating for yourself, isn't it? In terms of like being able to be very transparent in terms of what are your struggles, what makes you work better, what environment, for people to be able to understand. I think you're right. In some cases, the individual might actually not know exactly what will be working best for them. So I suppose that's where you come in to try
Yes.
and maybe bring up that some of the, what would work best for them in those scenarios that we're describing. I
Mhm.
mean, you also talk about the big picture thinking, intensity and being able to connect across sort of different levels. How does that show up in sort of practice?
So the intensity shows up where where it's challenging is in internal discussions, and the fact that so I often say to my ADHD leaders that regardless of whether it's their company or not, or even when it's not their company, they treat their company like it is their own. So in the psyche of an ADHD corporate leader who doesn't own the company is very similar to that of an ADHD entrepreneur. The self and the work are very, very merged. And that's where the intensity can be very, very rich, but also very, very challenging for others who may be able to have a better separation between their self and their work life. I think that one of the ways that's the what was the second one? You said intensity, and then you
Uh,
mentioned
the big picture thinking.
oh yes, and oh yes,
Yeah.
and also interacting with people at all levels. So um, the way that this shows up, and this is not always in an official capacity, but this non-compromising very process aware ADHD brain in a corporate setting is really, really good for when in highly regulated environments, when there is high regulatory scrutiny, when reputation is at stake. So when there's a lot of compliance obligation, where there's a strong compliance obligation on the organization. And so that's where the ADHD leaders are really, really strong, even if they may not be the chief risk officer. They will often show up with a very, very strong risk lens. And so this is where they are, I think that they're bringing something additional to any role that they have in the respect that because of the systemic thinking and the intensity, they are very hard to corrupt, right? And
Yeah. Yeah.
so if you want to make sure that you're playing by the book, if you want to make sure that your processes are efficient, that your resources are well spent, that there's no duplication of efforts within your company, like all those things that make the entire operations very neat. I think that ADHD leaders, whether or not it is within their scope of work, will always bring that lens.
I mean, if there was a leader listening to this podcast right now, and they feel like they're putting a lot of effort, but they're not getting any kind of recognition in terms of what they're putting in, what would you want them to hear?
Hmm. So maybe the first thing I would say, and this is a question they can start answering for themselves, is it actually not recognized as much as it should be? Because let's not forget that people with ADHD tend to need a lot of validation, perhaps sometimes more than others. So is their work actually not recognized to the level that it should be, or is it the way that they feel? So what is the data? What is the data that is proving that their work is not being valued as much? Perhaps that would be my first sort of thought. Then for I think that there's a part of responsibility that lays with the corporate environment, but there's also a big part of responsibility that lays with the individual. What can you do to make what can you do to be more transparent about the work that you are actually putting in? So, how can you be more transparent about the fact that if you are a chameleon interacting with the all levels of operations, how can you turn that into an asset that you can make visible? Another thing is also how can you reduce that invisible effort, obviously? So, how can you make sure that you take on less emotional labor or that you take on or that you don't over own negative outcomes? So, one thing that could be that, that could be a start is for every pain point or imperfect output that you tend to take upon yourself coming from your teams, for every one of those, make sure you own a positive one, right? Make sure that you keep things balanced already for yourself. I I'm not going to advise on diagnosis disclosure, but I can only encourage people to start becoming more, well, develop some awareness about what they need to work at their best and be very vocal about it. And to communicate communicate more about their needs.
Mm.
I think that the the responsibility where the responsibility lays with the individual is to seek support. And whether you put in place some sophisticated personal support systems for yourself at work and think about how to best allocate your energy, or whether you get a coach, or whether you try to get some suite of software or automations that are going to make your life easier. That also could be a way to diminish the imbalance.
From what I'm getting from you there, there's also a shift in your mindset, isn't it? Like a mindset shift um, or approach. There's a practical approach in terms of like what practical things that you could do as an individual, and then obviously your mindset also has to shift to some degree.
I I guess so. I mean, it's very difficult to give that as a, oh, here's what you need to do kind of conclusion, right? To
I get it. I get it.
our chat. But I think that I think that putting in place things for yourself and trying to see what are, so yes, there are practical things to put in place, and there are practical things you can put in place to make sure that the cognitive bandwidth that you dedicate to your self-regulation and your energy levels can be can be lighter or can be, that you can lighten that load. And the mindset shift is probably in, so I guess there are a couple. First of all, I would like ADHD leaders to remember that they, where they stand now, they have already defied all sorts of statistics. We know that ADHD and how it affects your trajectory is something that, usually means you don't succeed as much as statistically, right? You don't, there's less schooling success, less university success, less a lower employment rate, et cetera, et cetera. So where they are now, they have already defied all sorts of statistics, and there is a reason for that, right? So that's probably one of the things that I would like the ADHD leaders to sort of start integrating into their mindset is they are not delicate flowers to be managed or tiptoed around. They're actually warriors and they got there for a reason. And so maybe looking back on all the things that they have done well and are proud of is something that can help them shift their mindset.
Fine. Last one. Okay. Which one simple change that organizations could make that could make a real impact on the neurodiverse individual?
Hmm. Oh, we all like to want we want that single change. For ADHD leaders in particular, I think that hmm, I think that one of the ways that there could be a shift there is if organizations work on their assumptions, right? So all those leadership archetypes I was talking about, being open to redefining the contours of leadership and what it can look like. I think that that can be quite an interesting change. In practical terms, how you do it, well, that's really the million-dollar question that companies ask me every day. I think that if it's at all possible, and I know that for large companies, this can be a bit of a challenge, but embracing cognitive range in general, and incorporating that into the way companies onboard people, evaluate their performance, that could be quite interesting. So not only focusing on what the performance indicators are, or the performance in general is like, but also to try and see if there is a way for each person to be encouraged to become aware and be vocal about how they best work, what they need to work at their best. The answer is different, not just whether you have ADHD or not. Every person will answer that question very, very differently. So to basically start from the premise that not everyone is following the same template in terms of what context is conducive to their performance, that could be quite interesting. This will, of course, mean deconstructing a little bit the way that things are now with job descriptions, those role descriptions where a manager needs to be expected to do this, a leader needs to be expected to do this. So we can still have those lists, but but companies could become and should become more aware of how people can complement each other.
Yeah, I mean it's a nice way to end on that note. We've covered a lot. I've clearly enjoyed it. I'm clearly sitting down, talking to you, finding out more about your work, and certainly talking about this real issue that a lot of neurodiverse leaders out there experience. And I think I'm hoping that it resonates with a lot of our listeners. So, is there anything else we haven't covered that you might wanted to add before we kind of sum everything up?
Well, I think that what I would add is that if you want to future-proof your company, you absolutely need to have some ADHD leaders in your team.
And why did you say that?
I
What
say
benefit
that
does it have?
ADHD leaders are early detectors of what the future of work is like. ADHD leaders will usually, maybe that's something that I could have said before, but I will add it here. A lot of people with ADHD in leadership roles tell me, I told them so, right? They suffer from this chronic visionary thinking where they can see how things will evolve, how the market will evolve, and they usually can see risks before others can, thanks to that systemic thinking. They are very often not believed. And so 2 or 3 years later, whatever outcome they were predicting shows up, and they suffer from the fact that they probably were not able to articulate it in a change management oriented manner. But I think that if you want to future-proof your company, you need some ADHD leaders because they may bring to you problems or issues that you think are not there or are not there yet, but they are around the corner.
Yeah, that is a fascinating concept, to be fair. True, that is. And I don't think some companies might not even look at it in that way. Yeah, it's,
And yeah, unfortunately not. But
yeah.
this, when I was talking about the ADHD loneliness factor at the top, this contributes to it as well. The fact that very often ADHD leaders say, I was right. Do you know
Yeah.
what I say to them to help them translate that in the
Hmm.
I usually tell my clients, yes, you were right, but the way you were expressing it obviously didn't register. So I encourage you to now be more strategic and decide whether you want to be right or whether you want to get what you want. Those are two very different things. ADHD leaders often can get a little bit stuck and stubborn into being right. Being right is not enough in the corporate world.
Mm. It's yeah, it's as I said, it's a fascinating area, and I take my hat off to you. I don't sit down and talk to executive coaches like you about what we're discussing. It's a good insight to have someone like you coming on and share your experience and your insights in terms of this area that we're discussing today. And like I'll reiterate what I said earlier. I'm sure it's going to resonate with some people listening to this who are probably experiencing what you're describing. It could be an organization, it could be organizational leaders also wanting to learn more about this. I'm hoping that this would work as an eye opener to them as well. I know you work with clients internationally, not just in Luxembourg. How can people find out more about you and maybe access your services?
I have a website, mondaycoach.me. They are free to go on there, and if they want to get a taste for what I sound like, even if this podcast hopefully helped, there's some content on there that I've written about, some articles, other podcasts, etc. So they should feel free to go and check out my website. And and just reach out. I engage in first conversations quite regularly with no commitment, and so I like a one-on-one conversation, even in this era of AI. I like to have a conversation, and I do have an Instagram, and it's not as populated as I would hope. But hey, I have ADHD, so.
Um, Speaking of that, where are you with your own personal journey with living with ADHD?
Oh, I'm loving it. I'm finding myself in a point of my life that I wish upon every other ADHD person, where I am completely stepping into my strengths. I'm having fun in my professional life, my personal life. Um, it's interesting that you asked this, because I was prompted on social media a few days ago by one of those many apps that promises to make your life better as an ADHD person. And I just clicked on it. And the first question was, what areas of, or what ADHD challenges are you most struggling with at the moment? So there was the overwhelm, emotional dysregulation, et cetera, et cetera. And I couldn't, I couldn't take any of them.
Really?
I promise you, this is true.
Wow.
I thought, wow, I don't think this has ever happened before to me.
Hmm.
I was looking at the list and I was like, nope, nope, they're all good.
That's good. Whatever
Yeah.
you're doing, whatever you're utilizing, it's definitely working. So yeah.
Yeah, well,
Uh,
I don't know if this can help the ADHD leaders out there, but I know one of the things that I've been working on, sorry, for the last year, and that I think is really internalized now, is this entire thing of the visionary thinking. I know I have to wait sometimes 2 or 3 years for the market to catch up, or for uh, public opinion to catch up. And that's okay. And once I let go of that, that was a lot of emotional dysregulation out of the way. So there was nothing more to tick.
hmm. Yeah. Alexia, it's been absolute pleasure having you on our podcast.
Thank you for
Um,
having me.
um, Hopefully we will connect again. Are you coming to the conference in the
In
International Conference on
Baltimore,
ADHD
yes,
in
yes,
Baltimore? Yeah.
yes, yes. I just watched all of The Wire. Do you know that series,
Of
The
course, yeah,
Wire?
yeah. Yep.
I had never seen it before, and when I told someone I was going to Baltimore, they said you have to watch The Wire. So I am wired up. But
You wired
yes,
up.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Thanks for having me. I had a structure, I had my notes, but I didn't necessarily follow that flow, and maybe I should have warned you that no matter how prepared I am, it still goes a bit freestyle in the moment. But yeah.
Yeah. No, it's been really good to catch up with you. And yeah, certainly look forward to catching you in Baltimore in the US. For anyone who's wondering what we're talking about the International Conference on ADHD, which happens annually over in the US, in America. Last year, that's the first time we connected in Kansas
Yes.
City.
Hmm.
And obviously, I was quite fascinated to bring you on as a guest. And yeah, we stayed in touch since then.
Yeah. So let's stay in touch. If you have
We'll
any
do.
executives who need a coach, tell them I'm here.
I will do.
Uh, or if you have questions, anything,
Yeah.
like, really, let's be a
Let's
community.
let's be a community indeed. But yeah, certainly. And I'll add your contact details and website link into the podcast description when we release it. But
Okay.
yeah, for now, I'll say my goodbyes and once again, thanks for coming on as a guest.
Thank you. Thank you. Take
Take
care.
care. Have a good
Bye.
day. Cheers then. Bye. Bye.